In this lecture, we will cover Plato's metaphysics. Before jumping into Plato's metaphysics, however, let's step back and give a broad definition of the philosophical branch known as metaphysics. The word is derived from the Greek meta, meaning after, and physica, meaning physics. Hence the word metaphysics, or that which comes after the physics. In an interesting historical side note, the word actually comes from the placement of a treatise of Aristotle's that came directly after his physics. When Aristotle had passed on, his editors, in organizing his writings, placed the treatise that today we call the Metaphysics directly after the treatise called the Physics. Hence, that particular work of Aristotle's came to be called the Metaphysics, that which is after the Physics. Well, since the time of Aristotle, metaphysics has developed as a branch of philosophy in its own right. And we should think of metaphysics as the study of that which is above and beyond the physical world of sense experience. Or more simply put, think of it as the study of ultimate reality. What is most real? Is the physical world that we experience with our senses, is that most real? Or is there an immaterial world, not readily apparent to the senses, that is most real? Or maybe ultimate reality consists of a material and immaterial principle. That is a definite option. And then the question we could ask would be, well, how does a physical material object interact with an immaterial, invisible object? How are the two related to one another? Other questions that metaphysics deals with are questions of being. Not only what is the ultimate nature of being or the fundamental structure of being, but what are the different kinds of beings? How should we understand being itself? What definitions of the different beings are there? All of these would be questions that the branch of philosophy called metaphysics deals with. Is being material? Is it immaterial? Or could it be a combination of both? One of the central problems that metaphysical studies deals with is known as the problem of the one and the many. This is an ancient problem going all the way back to the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, but even before the big three of philosophy, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, there was a school, many schools rather, of philosophy that dealt with questions about the problem of the one and the many. Essentially, they were asking, is reality ultimately one, or is reality ultimately many? How should we understand the world around us? We see a diversity of objects, a diversity of physical objects. Some are animate, some are inanimate, some are small, some are large, some are hard, some are soft. How do we account for this diversity? Is there a fundamental unity, one fundamental substance that gives rise to the diversity of objects? If so, how? How could one fundamental substance give rise to such diversity that we see in the world? Or maybe reality lacks a unity. Maybe there is no unified whole, but everything is just a multiplicity of independent objects interacting with one another. That's a definite possibility. Is reality a multiplicity of changing things? Or is reality a unified, eternal, and immutable whole? Well, to answer this question is to jump into what's known as the problem of the one and the many, or the problem of diversity in unity. We experience a diversity of objects, but how can we give a philosophical explanation for that diversity? Well, various answers were put forward throughout the history of philosophy. Prior to Plato and Aristotle, and what we today call the pre-Socratics, various answers were put forward. But jumping to Plato, he attempts to do something, well, I think we could say pretty radical. He attempts to harmonize two different views into one coherent theory of reality. Plato takes the school of thought that says that reality is ultimately one, and he combines it with the school of thought that says that reality is ultimately many. And he combines them by preserving both in this attempt to construct one coherent overall theory of reality. So let's take a look at Plato's theory. Plato is known as a metaphysical dualist. So a dualist is someone who believes that reality is ultimately material and immaterial. Reality consists of two principles, material principle and an immaterial principle. And somehow these two principles interact with one another and relate to one another. Plato's metaphysical dualism postulates a two-tiered theory of reality. First, we have the sensible world of becoming, and this is the realm that most of us are familiar with. This is the realm where we experience changing, sensible objects. The world that you experience through your senses. Right? The world that you can see, the world that you can touch, taste, hear, and so on. This world ultimately, according to Plato, is characterized by change. It's characterized by becoming. Things come into existence, they exist for a while, and ultimately they go out of existence. They perish. Thus, we could say that the sensible world is subject to time and space. We experience this world through the senses, and it's something that we're all familiar with. All we have to do is look around us, and we can see things coming into existence and going out of existence. Right? Think of the four seasons that we experience. Right? Plant life comes into existence, it thrives for a short time, and ultimately it goes out of existence. Well, for Plato, this isn't the only reality. Okay, there's a whole other dimension to reality that we don't experience through our senses. And this is the real world of being. So notice here that we have a two-tiered theory of reality. We have the sensible world of becoming, the realm that we're all familiar with. All we have to do is look around and we experience it. But we also have a realm that deals with pure being itself. And for Plato, this is the world of ideas. The real world of being is the realm of universal forms and ideas. So Plato, in articulating this, is articulating his theory of forms or doctrine of ideas. And what's interesting to note about this world, we could say, for Plato, it's completely independent of the sensible world. And not only is it independent, it's also eternal, it's unchanging, and it's known through reason. So we can't see with our eyes, or hear with our ears, or feel with our hands this world of being. It has to be known through the mind, or through reason itself. But also notice the contrast between the two. Whereas the sensible world is characterized by particular objects, the world of being is characterized by universal ideas and forms. Okay, so the emphasis here is on the universal, not the particular. And we'll talk more throughout this lecture about what Plato means by an idea or form. But also notice this contrast. Whereas the sensible world is characterized by change in time and space, the world of being is characterized by immutability. Thus, the doctrines and the forms for Plato never undergo change. They're eternal. They're always the same. They don't come into existence. They don't go out of existence. But they're a permanent part of reality. And one more contrast, the sensible world is experienced with our senses, our five senses, whereas the real world of being is known through pure reason itself. Thus, we can see here in Plato's Metaphysics, as a dualist, Plato is trying to preserve both the sensible world, but also he wants to go above and beyond the sensible world to a world of pure being itself, where the objects are independent and eternal and known by reason. Okay, a couple terms before we move on to Plato's analogy of the sun, the divided line simile, and the allegory of the cave. On the previous slide, we looked at the contrast between the sensible world of becoming and the real world of being. The real world of being for Plato is characterized by what he calls a form or an idea. Okay, now the term form or idea has a very special meaning for Plato that it doesn't have for other philosophers in the history of philosophy. For Plato, a form is something immaterial, something we can't see, immutable, it's not subject to change, independently exists, which means it's not part of this world, nor is its existence dependent upon this world, and it's eternal. It doesn't undergo change. It always is. Those are the characteristics of a form. However, Plato goes a step further, arguing that the particular things of this